September 12, 1942. Somewhere in the jungle south of Henderson Field, Guadalcanal, the air was so thick with moisture that breathing felt like swallowing warm cloth. Major General Kiyotake Kawaguchi crouched beneath the canopy and listened to the sounds of 3,000 men trying to move quietly through terrain that made silence impossible. Every step cracked a branch. Every shift of a rifle sling caught on a vine. Somewhere behind him in the column, a soldier retched quietly, the sound swallowed almost immediately by the endless drone of insects that filled the jungle like static from a broken radio. His soldiers had been hacking through this undergrowth for 5 days. 5 days to cover what looked on the map like a straightforward march from the coast to the ridge south of the American airfield. But the map had lied, the way maps always lie about jungle. It had not mentioned the ravines choked with rotting vegetation so dense that a man could sink to his waist trying to cross them. It had not mentioned the root systems that rose waist-high from the jungle floor, turning every 100 yards into an obstacle course that exhausted men who were already carrying 60 pounds of equipment. It had not mentioned the mud, which in places was deep enough to suck a man's boots off his feet, or the rivers that had to be forded with weapons held overhead while leeches attached themselves to every inch of exposed skin. It had not mentioned the heat, which did not come in waves like desert heat but sat on the men like a weight, constant and inescapable, until their uniforms were so saturated with sweat that the fabric rubbed raw patches into their shoulders and thighs with every step. Men who had stormed the beaches of Borneo without hesitation, who had swept through the Philippines with the momentum of an entire empire behind them, now stumbled forward with hollow eyes, cracked lips, and blistered feet wrapped in disintegrating socks. They had abandoned most of their artillery along the trail because the jungle would not allow it through. Mountain guns designed to be broken down and carried by pack animals had proved too heavy for men who were already carrying their own ammunition, rations, and water. Mortar tubes had been left wedged between root systems that no amount of hacking could clear. Ammunition crates sat rotting in clearings, where exhausted porters had simply set down their loads and walked away, too spent to care about the consequences. Base plates for the heavier weapons lay scattered along the trail like breadcrumbs, marking the disintegration of a battle plan. At one point during the march, an entire battalion had lost contact with the main column and wandered through the jungle for a full day before rejoining on the morning of the 12th. Communications between units were sporadic at best and fictional at worst. The field radios, heavy, unreliable, and especially temperamental in tropical humidity, crackled with fragments of messages that nobody could fully decode. Officers who needed to coordinate their movements had no reliable way to reach each other. The three-pronged attack that Kawaguchi had designed on paper was already disintegrating before a single shot had been fired. But Kawaguchi was not worried, not truly. He had studied the maps at his headquarters. He had read the intelligence reports from Rabaul, and most importantly, he had seen with his own eyes the results of Japanese spiritual power against Western armies across the entire breadth of the Pacific. The British had crumbled in Malaya and Singapore, 80,000 men surrendering to a force half their size. The Dutch had folded in the East Indies within weeks of the first landings. The Americans themselves had raised the white flag at Corregidor after enduring a siege they ultimately lacked the will to fight through to its conclusion. Every campaign of the previous 7 months had confirmed what the Imperial Japanese Army had been teaching its officers for decades. That willpower, discipline, and the ancient warrior spirit of Yamato would always prevail over the material comforts and moral softness of the West. Kawaguchi believed this so completely that he had packed his dress-white uniform in his personal kit and brought it with him to Guadalcanal. He intended to wear it when the American general, Vandergrift, formally surrendered Henderson Field. He had even considered which words he would use at the ceremony, what posture he would strike as the defeated Americans lowered their flag. Somewhere ahead in the darkness, Beyond the ridge, the Japanese called the centipede for the way its segmented spine looked from aerial photographs. Approximately 840 United States Marines were digging foxholes, stringing barbed wire, and registering artillery coordinates on every approach the jungle offered. They were about to teach Kawaguchi a lesson that would take him the rest of his life to fully understand. To grasp why Kawaguchi approached that ridge with such certainty, you have to understand what the first 7 months of the Pacific War had done to the Japanese military mind. It was not merely confidence. It was something closer to a religious conviction. From December 1941 through the summer of 1942, the Imperial Japanese Army had not simply won battles. It had humiliated the Western colonial powers on a scale that stunned the entire world and that the powers themselves had believed impossible. Singapore fell in February 1942. General Tomoyuki Yamashita had driven his forces down the Malay Peninsula at a speed that outran the ability of the British to organize a coherent defense. When the supposedly impregnable fortress at the southern tip of the peninsula finally surrendered, over 80,000 British, Australian, and Indian troops laid down their arms before a Japanese force roughly half their number. It remains the largest capitulation in British military history. Winston Churchill called it the worst disaster in British arms. The Dutch East Indies collapsed weeks later, their colonial army dissolving like wet paper in the face of Japanese landings at multiple points across the archipelago. Borneo, Java, Sumatra, Celebes, Timor, all of them fell in a matter of weeks. The Philippines held out until May, but the fall of Corregidor and the surrender of more than 70,000 American and Filipino soldiers at Bataan added another chapter to a story the Japanese were telling themselves with increasing conviction. The Western soldier was soft. He valued his own survival too highly to fight to the death. When confronted by men who feared nothing, not even their own annihilation, he would hesitate, falter, and ultimately break. This belief had a name among the Japanese military establishment. They called it Seishin, the power of spirit. And by the summer of 1942, Seishin had evolved from an abstract philosophical concept into something far more dangerous. It had become tactical doctrine. It had been formalized into training manuals, woven into staff college lectures, and embedded in the planning assumptions of every major operation the Imperial Japanese Army conducted. Officers were taught, in complete seriousness, that one Japanese soldier, animated by the warrior code of Bushido and absolute devotion to the Emperor, was worth 10 of any Western enemy. This was not a figure of speech. This was not motivational rhetoric designed to boost morale before a difficult operation. This was the actual mathematical basis upon which attacks were planned and troop requirements were calculated. The Imperial Japanese Army genuinely designed assaults around the assumption that spiritual superiority would more than compensate for material disadvantage. Night attacks with fixed bayonets against prepared defensive positions were not considered desperate measures of last resort, employed only when all other options had been exhausted. They were the preferred tactical approach, the purest expression of a warrior ethos that valued cold steel and raw courage over the mechanical impersonality of firepower and the defensive mentality of fortification. A Japanese officer who chose to soften an enemy position with prolonged artillery bombardment before sending in the infantry was, in the culture of the Imperial Army, displaying a weakness of spirit. The man who led a screaming bayonet charge into the teeth of enemy machine guns was the ideal, and for 7 months, against enemies who obliged by breaking and running, this approach had worked. 3 weeks before Kawaguchi reached that ridge, this assumption had already been tested on Guadalcanal and found catastrophically, irrecoverably wrong. But the lesson had not been learned, because the men in charge of learning it had refused to believe the evidence. Colonel Kiyotake had landed at Taivu Point on the night of August 18 with 916 men from his elite 28th Infantry Regiment. These were not second-line garrison troops cobbled together from rear echelon units. They were hardened veterans who had been originally selected for the planned invasion of Midway Island before the Japanese naval defeat there cancelled the operation. Rerouted to Guadalcanal with orders to recapture Henderson Field and drive the Americans into the sea, Ichiki had been briefed at the Japanese naval base at Truk that he might face as many as 10,000 Americans on the island, and was explicitly instructed to scout the enemy positions carefully and to avoid frontal assaults against prepared defences. He dismissed every word of it. The victory disease had seeped so deeply into his thinking that he decided to attack immediately with just his first echelon of 900 men, not even bothering to wait for the remaining 1,400 troops of his regiment who were still en route. He was so certain of what would happen that he wrote in his personal journal a simple 3-line battle plan that doubled as a prophecy. August 18, landing. August 20, march by night and battle. August 21, enjoyment of the fruit of victory. There was no enjoyment on August 21. There was only death. In the pre-dawn darkness, Ichiki's regiment charged straight into prepared marine positions at Alligator Creek, a tidal lagoon on the eastern edge of the American perimeter that had been misidentified on marine maps as the Tenaru River. The Marines of the 2nd Battalion, 1st Marines under Lieutenant Colonel Edwin Pollock, were dug in behind sandbags with interlocking fields of machine gun fire that turned the sandbar at the creek's mouth into a killing ground. Pre-registered mortar positions covered every approach. Barbed wire obstacles channeled attackers into the beaten zones of the automatic weapons. Ichiki's soldiers ran directly into all of it. Bayonets fixed, screaming war cries, they charged across the sandbar silhouetted against the faint luminescence of the tropical water, and the Marines cut them down in rows. The Browning .30 caliber machine guns fired until their barrels glowed. Bodies stacked up on the sandbar 3 and 4 deep. Still the Japanese came, climbing over their own dead to reach the Marine lines. Because Seishin demanded it, and because their training had taught them that the Americans would break if only they could close the distance and make it personal. The Americans did not break. They fired until the ammunition belts ran dry, reloaded, and fired again. By daybreak, the Marine commander ordered a counterattack. Light Stuart tanks rolled across the sandbar and swept through a coconut grove where the surviving Japanese had taken cover. The tanks crushed men beneath their treads, while their 37mm cannons and machine guns methodically cleared the grove. Overhead, aircraft from Henderson Field strafed anything that moved. Rear Admiral Raizo Tanaka, who had helped transport Ichiki's men, would later reflect bitterly that this tragedy should have taught us the hopelessness of bamboo spear tactics. When it was over, approximately 800 of the 917 Japanese soldiers who had come ashore were dead. Colonel Ichiki either fell in the fighting or committed ritual suicide. Accounts differ, and his body was never conclusively identified among the heaped dead on the sandbar. Only about 30 men escaped through the jungle to Taivu Point. The few survivors radioed Rabaul that the Ichiki detachment had been almost annihilated at a point short of the airfield. It was the first time in the war that an entire Japanese assault force of this size had been effectively wiped out. At 17th Army headquarters in Rabaul, the reaction was not reconsideration, it was denial. Lieutenant General Harukichi Hyakutake's operations officer, Colonel Hiroshi Matsumoto, personally knew Ichiki and flatly refused to accept the report. 2 days after the battle, Rabaul was still transmitting messages claiming that the Ichiki detachment was in good shape near the airfield, apparently still storming it. Gunfire heard near the airfield was interpreted as evidence that Ichiki was still fighting, when in reality the gunfire was Marines mopping up scattered survivors who refused to surrender. When the truth finally became undeniable, Hyakutake did what the Japanese command structure would do repeatedly throughout the Guadalcanal campaign. He minimized the scope of the disaster, radioed Tokyo that the attack of the Ichiki detachment was not entirely successful, and immediately began planning a larger assault with more troops. Not once, At any level of the Japanese chain of command, from Hyakutake's staff at Rabaul to Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo, did anyone stop to question whether their fundamental assumptions about American fighting capacity might be catastrophically wrong? The answer to failure was simply to do the same thing again, harder, with more men. They sent Kawaguchi. By late August, Kawaguchi's 35th Infantry Brigade had reached Truk and was being loaded onto slow transport ships for the final leg to Guadalcanal. These were not green recruits being fed into a grinder they did not understand. The 35th were combat veterans of campaigns in China and British Borneo. Kawaguchi himself had led amphibious landings at Miri, Kuching, Brunei, Jesselton, and Sandakan. He was experienced, adaptable, and by the accounts of officers who served under him, genuinely concerned about the welfare of his men. He once gave a soldier who had been assigned a particularly dangerous mission a can of sardines that he had personally carried from Japan. Richard Frank, in his definitive account of the Guadalcanal campaign, noted that for Kawaguchi, orders merely formed a handy agenda for discussion. It was a characterization that pointed to both his independence and his stubbornness. But whatever his virtues as a commander, Kawaguchi also shared the fatal assumption that had destroyed Ichiki. He believed in his bones that Japanese spiritual power would prevail, where Japanese material power could not. The logistics of getting his brigade to Guadalcanal illustrated the problem perfectly. Damage inflicted on a Japanese troop convoy during the naval battle of the Eastern Solomons in late August convinced the Japanese to stop trying to deliver reinforcements by slow transport ship. Instead, Kawaguchi's soldiers would be shuttled to the island aboard fast destroyers, making overnight runs through the channel the Allies called the Slot and the Japanese called the Route for rat transportation. These midnight runs could deliver men, but they could not deliver heavy equipment. Artillery pieces were too large and too heavy. Vehicles could not fit below decks. Large quantities of food and ammunition had to be left behind at staging bases. Japanese soldiers arrived on Guadalcanal's shores with their rifles, a few days' rations, and whatever ammunition they could carry in their packs and on their belts. They were at a material disadvantage from the moment their boots touched sand. Between August 29 and September 4, fast destroyers, light cruisers, and patrol boats delivered nearly 5,000 troops to Taivu Point, east of the marine perimeter. General Kawaguchi himself stepped ashore on August 31 and was immediately placed in command of all Japanese forces on the island. A separate barge convoy delivered another 1,000 men under Colonel Akinosuke Oka to Kamimbo, west of the American positions. By early September, Kawaguchi had roughly 6,000 soldiers at his disposal. He had the numbers. What he did not have was the firepower to support them. On September 7th, he issued his attack order with characteristic directness: rout and annihilate the enemy in the vicinity of the Guadalcanal Island airfield. His plan divided his forces into 3 groups for a coordinated night attack. Oka's 1,000 men would strike the perimeter from the west. The Kuma Battalion, the reorganized survivors of Ichiki's regiment, now under Major Takeshi Mizuno, would attack from the east near Alligator Creek. And Kawaguchi himself would lead the main body, his center body of 3,000 men in 3 infantry battalions, on a jungle march south of the marine perimeter to attack straight up the ridge from below. If all 3 attacks hit simultaneously, the Americans would be unable to shift reserves, and the thin perimeter would crack. It was a sound plan on paper. In the jungle, at night, with broken communications and exhausted troops who had abandoned their heavy weapons along the trail, it was made of glass. What Kawaguchi did not know was that the Americans had already found him, and that the intelligence they gathered would reshape the entire defensive plan. On September 8, Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Edson led 813 of his raiders and paramarines on a lightning raid against Kawaguchi's supply base at the village of Tasimboko near Taivu Point. Edson expected perhaps 300 poorly armed defenders. Instead, most of Kawaguchi's combat troops had already melted into the jungle for the march south, leaving behind a rear guard and an immense quantity of supplies. What the raiders discovered at Tasimboko was astonishing. Enormous stockpiles of food sufficient for 6,000 troops, canned crab, sardines, anchovies, and rice, bottles of beer and sake, medical supplies, including surgical equipment, strange glass vessels filled with fluid that the Marines concluded were some type of incendiary firebomb, perhaps 500,000 rounds of ammunition, a powerful shortwave radio, stacks of intelligence documents detailing troop dispositions, unit strengths, and operational plans. And in Kawaguchi's personal quarters, carefully folded and packed as though for a formal occasion, his dress-white uniform, ready for the surrender ceremony he had been anticipating since he left Truk. The raiders destroyed every supply they could not carry. They ate the best of the Japanese food, loaded their packs with intelligence documents and whatever else seemed useful, and despoiled the rest. Raider John Sweeney later recalled the scene with characteristic bluntness. "We destroyed everything we could not take. One way of despoiling the food was to urinate on it. We peed on it." At a cost of 2 killed and 6 wounded, the raiders had wiped out a brigade's entire supply base and recovered intelligence that would prove decisive. Major Samuel Griffith, Edson's executive officer, called it one of the really very successful small operations of World War II. But what Edson did with the intelligence mattered more than the raid itself. He studied the captured documents. He consulted with Colonel Gerald Thomas, Vandergrift's operations officer. He looked at the map and read the terrain the way he had been reading terrain for 20 years, from Nicaragua to Tulagi. And he concluded, against the prevailing assumption among the division staff, that the main Japanese attack would not come from the coast, as Ichiki's had. It would come from the south, up the ridge. On September 10th, Edson moved his mixed battalion of roughly 840 raiders and paramarines onto the ridge and told them it was a rest area. Nobody believed him for long. The very next day, Japanese bombers dropped their payloads directly onto the ridge instead of Henderson Field, their usual target. 11 Marines were killed and 14 wounded. But the tactical significance was what mattered. That kind of precision, bombs falling on the ridge and not the airfield, meant the Japanese knew exactly where the Marines were positioned, which confirmed that the ridge was the objective. Edson immediately began ordering defensive preparations on a scale that made the word rest, obviously, and permanently ridiculous. Foxholes were deepened. Fields of fire were cleared through the jungle scrub. Barbed wire was strung across the approaches. Artillery coordinates were plotted and registered with the 11th Marines, whose 75mm pack howitzers were positioned near the Lunga perimeter. Edson organized his rifle units into small fighting groups of 3 or 4 Marines, built around an automatic weapon, either a Browning automatic rifle or a Thompson submachine gun. It was a technique he had developed years earlier fighting guerrillas in the Nicaraguan jungles during the interwar banana wars, and it was perfectly suited to the broken terrain and limited visibility of the Guadalcanal Ridge. 5 companies of raiders were positioned on the western side, their right flank secured by the Lunga River. Paramarines held the eastern positions. The terrain was too dense and too broken for a continuous defensive line anywhere except the ridge crest itself, so the Marines formed a series of strongpoints connected by overlapping fields of fire rather than physical contact. It was a thin line, an 1,800-yard front defended by 840 men, many of whom had never fought in jungle conditions before the month of September. At 2100 hours on the night of September 12, Japanese naval shells began falling on the ridge, the opening signal of Kawaguchi's assault. The shells were inaccurate, but they accomplished their purpose. Everyone on the ridge now knew that the attack was coming. Minutes later, screaming voices erupted from the jungle on every side. Kawaguchi's soldiers burst from the tree line in waves, hurling strings of firecrackers that popped and cracked in the darkness, a disorientation tactic designed to mask the sounds of movement and sow confusion among the defenders. Listening posts were overrun within minutes. Forward positions were swallowed by the chaos of men fighting at close quarters in near total darkness, where friend and enemy were indistinguishable beyond arm's length. But Kawaguchi's first night attack immediately began to unravel in ways that revealed the fundamental problem with his plan. His battalions, already fragmented by 5 days of brutal jungle marching, could not coordinate their movements in the darkness. The 1st and 3rd Battalions of the 124th Infantry arrived late at their assembly area, well past the planned 2000 hours start time. Kawaguchi adjusted on the fly, shifting his axis of attack to push between the Lunga River and the ridge, but in the darkness his units collided with each other, intermixed, and lost what little cohesion the jungle had left them. The 4th Regiment's 2nd Battalion never reached the ridge at all. The Kuma Battalion assembled too far to the east and made no contact with the Americans. Of Kawaguchi's entire centre body, only scattered elements of 2 battalions actually engaged the Marine positions, and while they managed to infiltrate between raider strongpoints and push some companies back toward the ridge crest, they did not achieve the breakthrough that the plan required. When dawn came on September 13, both sides assessed the night's work. The Japanese withdrew into the jungle to regroup. The Marines counted their losses and began preparing for what they knew was coming next. Edson spent September 13 pulling his Marines back approximately 100 yards to tighter, more defensible positions along the ridge crest. He consolidated his line, cleared new fields of fire, and had fresh artillery coordinates plotted and registered. Reinforcements had been requested, but Japanese air activity over the perimeter delayed their arrival. A battalion finally reached the area at dusk, but could only take up supporting positions behind the ridge. The front line itself, the thin crust of men who would absorb the next Japanese assault, still consisted of roughly 400 raiders and paramarines. Red Mike Edson gathered his men and told them the truth, delivered in a voice that carried no sentimentality and no illusions. This is it. It is useless to ask ourselves why it is we who are here. We are here. There is only us between the airfield and the Japanese. If we do not hold, we will lose Guadalcanal. On the other side of the jungle, Kawaguchi was regrouping with a confidence that his own casualties had not diminished. His men had pushed the Americans back on the first night. They had penetrated the line. In his mind, this proved the superiority of spirit. His soldiers cheered throughout the day as Japanese aircraft from Rabaul bombed American positions. Kawaguchi moved his attack time earlier than planned, to 1830, eager to seize the airfield before the Imperial Navy arrived at midnight for a scheduled bombardment. At 1830, on September 13, 3,000 Japanese soldiers attacked the ridge for the second time. The assault hit the Marine right flank first, and this time it hit with concentrated force. Kawaguchi's men breached the defensive line and surged through a 200-yard gap, flooding toward the airfield. On the ridge itself, 2 companies charged straight up the southern slopes toward Hill 123, the dominant terrain feature. The Marines at the lower positions were overwhelmed and driven back up the slope. Baker Company of the 1st Raiders and 2 companies of Paramarines, roughly 300 exhausted men, found themselves absorbing the full weight of nearly 2 full Japanese battalions, pressing uphill with bayonets fixed and officers screaming commands that could barely be heard over the gunfire. The fighting became something beyond tactics or training or rational thought. It was hand-to-hand combat in the purest and most brutal sense. Bayonet against bayonet, rifle butt against skull, entrenching tool against throat. Marines and Japanese soldiers were so intermingled in the darkness and the smoke that artillery observers crouching in their foxholes with telephone handsets pressed to their ears could not distinguish friendly from enemy positions. Officers fired their pistols at shapes emerging from the murk. Enlisted men threw grenades at sounds in the grass and hoped the screams that followed were not American. Major Kenneth Bailey moved through the chaos like a man who had decided that death was irrelevant, rallying Marines, grabbing panicked men who had begun to fall back, and physically turning them around to face the enemy surging up the hill. At some point the word withdraw had been shouted, and exhausted, terrified Marines had started to run. Bailey and a handful of junior officers stopped the retreat at the crest of the ridge. In doing so, they saved the airfield and possibly the entire campaign. And then the artillery spoke. Forward observers on the ridge, men lying flat in shallow holes with field telephones pressed against their ears, radioed back to Colonel Pedro Del Vae's 11th Marines with a fire mission that would become one of the most famous in the history of the Pacific War. Drop it 5-0 and walk it back and forth across the ridge. It is knocking the hell out of them. The gunners obeyed without hesitation. 105mm shells began crashing along the ridge and into the jungle approaches below it in a curtain of steel, so sustained and so devastating that surviving Japanese soldiers would later describe the American howitzers in terms of awestruck disbelief. They called it automatic artillery. They could not comprehend how shells could fall so fast, so accurately, and so close to the American lines without killing the Americans themselves. The answer was something the Japanese had never encountered in their campaigns against the British, the Dutch, or the colonial armies of Southeast Asia. It was trust. The Marines on the ridge trusted the gunners behind them to keep the shells close enough to shred the Japanese formations without killing the defenders. And the gunners trusted the forward observers to call corrections in real time, adjusting fire yard by yard as the battle shifted. It was a system of coordinated firepower that required training, communication, and a willingness to accept extraordinary risk. And it worked with lethal precision on the night of September 13. The artillery tore enormous holes in the Japanese formations. Men who had been charging forward in organized waves were shredded by shrapnel, blown sideways by concussion, and scattered into small groups of dazed survivors crawling forward over the bodies of their comrades. Shell after shell, walking back and forth across the approaches, turning the jungle floor into a landscape of splintered trees, cratered earth, and human remains. But still they came, because the doctrine of Seishin demanded it, because Kawaguchi's officers drove their men forward at sword point when necessary, because the training of a lifetime told them that if they could just close the distance, just reach the American foxholes with cold steel in their hands, the soft Westerners would break and run. They did not break, they did not run, and the men kept dying on the slopes of that ridge. Unrelenting Japanese pressure ground Edson's command down to roughly 300 effectives. The Marine line was pushed back to within 1,000 yards of the runway, so close that the sound of fighting was audible to ground crews at Henderson Field. Isolated groups of Japanese soldiers broke through the line entirely. Some reached the fighter strip, where startled ground personnel shot them down. Some were killed trying to climb onto parked aircraft. In the most extraordinary moment of the entire battle, a Japanese officer and 2 soldiers actually penetrated all the way to General Vandergrift's division command post, where they were killed as they charged the general himself. On the ridge, Edson seemed to be in every place at once, rounding up stragglers, directing fire, ordering local counterattacks, and rallying men at the points of greatest pressure. Private First Class Tom Watson, an artillery battery clerk who had no business being on the front line, had rushed forward on his own initiative and was calling in fire corrections with such precision that the shells fell within yards of friendly positions without killing a single Marine. He received a battlefield commission after the fight. By 02:30 in the morning, with the battle still raging but the worst of the pressure beginning to ease, Edson picked up his field telephone and radioed Vandergrift with 3 words that contained the fate of Guadalcanal: "We can hold." At 0400, reinforcements from the 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines began filtering into the line, relieving the most shattered positions. At 0530, the attack ground to a halt, not because Kawaguchi ordered a withdrawal, because he had run out of live bodies before the Marines ran out of live ammunition to keep their machine guns firing. As dawn broke, Army Air Force's P-400 Airacobras took off from Henderson Field and sprayed what was left of Kawaguchi's formations with 20mm cannon fire as they tried to regroup in the jungle behind the ridge. The Japanese flank attacks by Oka in the west and the Kuma Battalion in the east had been no more successful. The Battle of Edson's Ridge was over. In the morning light, Marines walked among the dead. They counted approximately 600 Japanese bodies on and around the ridge, including 200 sprawled across the slopes of Hill 123. In total, Kawaguchi's forces lost an estimated 830 killed across all attacking units. 350 from the Tamura Battalion, 200 from the Kokusho Battalion, 120 from Oka's force, 100 from the Kuma Battalion, 60 from the Watanabe Battalion. An unknown number of wounded would die during the retreat that followed. Marine losses across both nights of fighting were approximately 80 killed and 104 wounded. At 13:05 on September 14, Kawaguchi gathered the survivors of his shattered brigade and led them away from the ridge, deeper into the jungle. What followed was not a retreat. It was a death march. His soldiers had eaten their last rations the morning before the second attack. They now had to cross miles of mountainous jungle terrain while carrying their wounded comrades on improvised stretchers, with no food, no medical supplies, and morale that was collapsing by the hour. Almost every soldier still able to walk was burdened with a wounded man who could not. One Japanese officer kept a diary during the withdrawal, and his words captured the complete scope of the catastrophe with a rawness that no official report could match. I cannot help from crying when I see the sight of those men marching without food for 4 or 5 days and carrying the wounded through the curving and sloping mountain trails. The wounds could not be given adequate medical treatment. There was not a one without maggots. Many died. As the march continued, the once proud 35th Brigade began to shed everything that made it an army. First, the heavy weapons were abandoned along the trail. Then the light weapons, machine guns, and grenade launchers left propped against trees or dropped in the mud. Then packs and personal equipment. By the time the surviving column reached Colonel Oka's positions at Kokumbona 5 days later, only half the men still carried their rifles. The Kuma Battalion fared even worse. Attempting to follow Kawaguchi's route, they became completely lost in the jungle, wandered for 3 weeks through terrain that offered nothing edible, and nearly starved to death before finally staggering into camp looking more like animated skeletons than soldiers. Of the approximately 6,000 men Kawaguchi had commanded when he stepped ashore on Guadalcanal, barely half remained, and most of those were in no condition to hold a weapon. When news of the defeat reached 17th Army headquarters at Rabaul, Hyakutake's staff officers were reduced to what one account described as foot-stamping fury. This was the Imperial Japanese Army's first defeat involving a unit of brigade size in the entire war. The shock radiated upward through the chain of command. In an emergency session at Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo, the senior Army and Navy staff reached a conclusion that would have been unthinkable 6 months earlier, when the Empire was sweeping everything before it across the Pacific. Guadalcanal might develop into the decisive battle of the war. Admiral Yamamoto agreed with his staff that nothing short of a full division assault could now retake the island. They were right about the importance. They were wrong about the solution. In late October, the Japanese sent a full division. Major General Masao Maruyama led his Sendai Division, 7,000 combat veterans, down a nightmare jungle trail they named the Maruyama Road, aimed at the exact same objective: Edson's Ridge, Henderson Field. And they suffered the exact same fate. The jungle consumed their artillery before they reached the start line. Their formations fragmented during the approach march. Their communications collapsed. Heavy rain fell on the afternoon of October 24, turning the jungle floor to mud, and causing chaos in formations already exhausted from days of marching. When they finally reached the American perimeter, now defended by Chesty Puller's 1st Battalion, 7th Marines, reinforced by the Army's 164th Infantry Regiment, they were met by the same answer that Kawaguchi had received. Marine machine guns, mortars, and artillery shattered every attack. Sergeant John Basilone's 30-caliber machine gun positions killed nearly an entire Japanese company in 5 minutes. By morning, 941 more Japanese bodies lay on and around the ridge. General Nasu, who commanded the left-wing assault, was among the dead. The Americans held. Again. Kawaguchi himself returned to Guadalcanal with the Sendai Division, given command of a detachment for the right wing of the October offensive. But the man who had once packed dress whites for a surrender ceremony had changed. He concluded that a frontal assault up the ridge was suicide, altered his approach without informing his superior officer, arrived late, and delivered an uncoordinated attack that achieved nothing. He was promptly relieved of command and recalled to Tokyo. The general, who had viewed orders as a handy agenda for discussion, had finally found an order he should have followed. Forced onto the reserve list in 1943, he spent the last years of the war in obscurity, commanding the coastal defences of a minor island. After the surrender, he was convicted of war crimes for atrocities committed during the Philippine campaign under his command and imprisoned until 1953. But it was something Kawaguchi wrote about Guadalcanal that outlasted every battle report, every staff analysis, and every court proceeding. Looking back on what he had experienced, on the thousands of men he had led to their deaths against a ridge held by Marines who simply would not give way no matter what was thrown at them, Kawaguchi composed a single sentence that served as the epitaph for an entire army's delusions. Guadalcanal is not the name of an island. It is the name of the graveyard of the Japanese army. Edson received the Medal of Honor for his actions on the ridge and was promoted to colonel. Major Kenneth Bailey, who had stopped the panicked retreat and turned the battle at its most desperate moment, also received the Medal of Honor, awarded posthumously after he was killed in action later in the Guadalcanal campaign. The Paramarines, who had landed on Guadalcanal on August 7 with 377 men, were reduced to approximately 86 survivors and left the island on September 18. The raiders had gone ashore with 750 men and sustained 234, killed, wounded, or missing over the course of the fighting. In February 1943, 6 months after the first Marine boot had touched sand on the island, the Japanese finally withdrew their remaining forces from Guadalcanal. America's first step on the long road to Tokyo was complete. A Japanese prisoner captured on the ridge had spoken ominously to his captors in the aftermath of the battle. "Make no matter about us dead. More will come. We never stop coming. Soon you all be Japanese." He was half right. More did come. They never stopped coming. Wave after wave, brigade after brigade, division after division, thrown against that ridge and the men who defended it. But they never took the ridge. They never took the airfield. And every wave that broke against those Marine positions left behind more evidence of a truth that Kawaguchi, Ichiki, Hyakutake, Maruyama, and the entire Imperial Japanese command structure had been unable to accept until the jungle of Guadalcanal taught it to them in the only language war has ever spoken. Spirit does not stop bullets. Willpower does not silence artillery. And the men on that ridge, 800 Marines, who let 3,000 Japanese surround them in the darkness and fought through the night with bayonets, grenades, entrenching tools, and bare fists when the ammunition ran low, were not the soft, undisciplined Westerners the propaganda had promised them. They were something the Japanese Empire had never encountered before and would never find an answer for. Not on Guadalcanal, not on any island that followed, not until the day the war ended and the Empire with it. These stories cost something to live through. They cost young men their futures, families their sons, and survivors their peace. The least we can do is make sure they are not forgotten. If these stories matter to you, subscribe and share them with someone who needs to hear them. Be part of that. I will see you next time.